you guys see there was this whole debate when Trump made that joke that he was going to annex Canada?
Yeah.
Right? And there was actually a lot of conservatives who went totally mask off and were like, yeah,
Yeah.
I would love it if Canada was part of the United States. Trump, please, Daddy Trump, take us. And it sounds like a joke, right? But like historically, and at least recent history, like in the past 30 years, the right, or at least the mainstream right, is so pro-American in the sense that they're willing to kind of go on board with whatever America does, whether it be, wanting to be more economically like them, or whether to actually just be on board with their foreign policy agendas.
Mhm.
They want to be on board with everything that's happening with Israel. They want to give more money to Israel. They want to be involved in these conflicts that I don't think most Canadians care to be involved in. I've been thinking this for a while, but there is a sort of huge void in Canada for a kind of socialist movement that is patriotic, dare I say nationalistic. That might seem controversial to leftists today, because you say nationalism, socialism, oh, I hear Nazism, right? But, that's a certain kind of nationalism. First off, nationalism can take different contexts, and there's progressive nationalism, there's highly reactionary nationalism. In a lot of contexts, nationalism meant bringing people together, not dividing people, right?
Mhm.
Immigrants are some of the most patriotic people. I mean, because it's like especially if you come from a poorer country, or a country that's, might have a more repressive government, you are like very happy to be here, So it's like the idea that nationalism can't be inclusive is ridiculous to me. I mean, it's like, don't be a xenophobic moron. Like it's not that complicated. But also we kind of tend to forget the history of socialism, like movements that took power. All of them, whether initially when they came to power or later on as they try to maintain power, ended up embracing some sort of nationalism. Castro comes to power,
Yeah.
National Liberation Movement. Vietnam, nationalist movement that's socialist. China, to this day, class consciousness only goes so far.
It does.
Now, class consciousness is good, but the idea you can mobilize everyone in the country, well, I mean, of course not everyone, but like everyone even of that class in that country, let alone workers of the world,
Yeah.
it's never happened. It doesn't speak to people's souls. That's kind of why nationalism appealed to people much more than the idea of workers of the world unite ever did. Because even the socialist movements realized this, and they all kind of used that. They kind of all ended up, speaking to the idea. Like,
you're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, we're going to be talking about Canada, a topic that nobody outside of Canada seems to really care about. And us Canadians are always perplexed. Why does no one care about Canada? Then I think to myself, when does anyone care about Australia? So, fair enough. But Canada has been going through a lot of different political shifts in the past decade, arguably. And now that Donald Trump is elected in the United States, people are wondering, well, maybe not a lot of people are wondering, but I hope you guys are, what's going on in Canada? And some people have described the surging political leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, as Canada's next Donald Trump. I'm not sure if I really buy that, but I'll be curious what you guys think. But more broadly, we're going to talk about the state of Canadian politics, the left, the right, and the center. starting with the right and then the status quo, and then a left, because all three of us are probably a little biased, or all four of us, I guess, are a bit biased. We tend to be left of center, to put it lightly. And yeah, with me, I have three Canadian leftists, part of the Democratic Socialists of Canada. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Democratic Socialists of America. Would you guys like to introduce yourself and why you joined the DSC?
Sure, yeah, I can start. Hi, everyone. My name is Matthias. I am the co-chair of the Toronto chapter of the DSC. And I joined largely because I sort of realized that I needed to put a theory to practice, largely. Rose, you want to go next?
Yeah, hello. My name's Rose Danon, and I'm also a member of the DSC. I've been a member for about, 4 months now? 5 months now? Time's flown by. And I've been just jumping right in and helping with a bunch of different things. My big passion is community and helping build community. And surprisingly, socialism, well, not surprisingly, if anyone knows anything about socialism is built on community and supporting your neighbors. And so I've been looking for a while to find a space that belonged to me. And so the DSC has been that spot for me for the last few months, and it's been great. But yeah, as I talk, you'll notice a lot of my rhetoric is around community and community building.
Yeah, my name is Umer. I joined the DSC 3 years ago now, I guess. I'm currently serving as the internal organizing director for Toronto. And the reason I joined, I don't know the exact reason I joined specific. I mean, I wanted to finally do something about the political thoughts I had in my head. So I just typed in Democratic Socialists of Canada to see if it existed, and it did.
I think that's something a lot of people who do organize might find it a little relatable. It's like, when are we going to actually do something? And, people ask me a lot with regards to Canada about organizing. People in my Discord, they're saying, I want to organize, where should I get started? And I always say, I'm not the best person to really advise that, because in Canada, I find the state of the left to be quite abysmal. And it's quite difficult because even though we have a left party known as the New Democratic Party of Canada, the NDP, the parties in Canada are notoriously just very hard to change. It's not very easy to just become part of the hierarchy and, gradually influence them, because they have a sort of, ironically, a kind of vanguardist structure, actually, like a bit of a top-down, a Leninist structure for all Canadian right-wingers and liberals like to criticize communism. They have a very Leninist top-down structure to purge any sort of dissent in their party. So it's quite hard to change. And the Democratic Socialists of America is something a lot of people have increasingly taken interest in, especially since the rise of Bernie Sanders, AOC, the Squad. And of course, many people are part of the DSA aren't just necessarily social democrats. There are people all across the left spectrum, Marxists. I know I had a Maoist on the show, if some might remember, Black Redguard, who was in the DSA. So yeah, we're going to talk about the DSA towards the end, and about what's different.
DSC.
Right, about the DSC. Yes, exactly. And what makes it different from the DSA and the history of it, because of course it's much newer. But first, let's wind back a little bit into the political scene of the present moment. And it's not really clear to everyone. We might say, oh, Canada is shifting rightward, but that's a question I do want to pose immediately. Are we shifting rightward? Because everyone's saying Canada is shifting right. I think it's more complicated than that, but I'd be curious what you guys think about how Canada's shift generally in the past, let's say 5 years, because I think since COVID is when people have really begun to notice different changes. Whoever wants to go first.
My answer for this would be no, I don't think we are going more towards the right. I think a lot of people think we are going more towards the right because they're looking towards the next election and they are seeing a very likely conservative Pierre Poilievre win. And I think a lot of people think that means we are moving more conservatively. But I think it's really important, especially in Canada's case, to look at the history of our politics and how Canada's politics ebbs and flows with the times. And this is very par for the course for Canada. For those who aren't huge political science nerds like myself, the Liberal Party is very much a centrist party, very much a catch-all party, which means that their job is to catch as many people as possible. So they don't really take strong stances on anything. A lot of people like to think the Liberal Party is left, but it is not. They are just a for everyone type party, right? So they're not going to take particularly strong stances. They are going to take stances that are the most popular, which in that sense means, as we know, the Liberals have been taking more left stances over the last decade or two, which is usually a sign that our Overton window of Canada is moving over to the left and the Liberal Party is moving with it. The popular discourse in Canada is more left leaning, and so the Liberal Party ebbs and flows with that. As for us moving
level
towards
of rhetoric.
yeah. As for the Conservative Party and looking at the election coming up in the new year, historically, Canada goes back and forth between parties, and usually the switch every 8 to 10 years is not because of which way we are leaning, but more so we are just sick of the current party in power, the current politicians in power, and Canada just wants to change. And usually the Conservatives are the next one in line for that change. Canadians have a very, very short memory when it comes to politics, and so they think that this is a new age change, but we have historically switched between Conservative and Liberal very much so, just because even though we are a multi-party system, the other parties haven't had a strong hold yet, at least on the federal level. So I think this is more a reflection of not so much us going more towards the right and us going towards Pierre Poilievre, but more so Canadians running away from Justin Trudeau and being sick of Justin Trudeau and going for whatever is next on the ticket, right? And just the NDP and the Green Party just hasn't had the strength yet to fill that number 2 position. So
I think to
that's
kind
where I
of
would start.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on Rose's analysis, I think Poilievre and just generally like the conservative trend in this country, I think is really interesting because kind of like the title's alluding, there's questions always, is Poilievre the next Donald Trump? I guess without going too far into that yet, I personally do not believe so. We don't see the same sort of, let's say, like Bonapartism, if you want to use that, with Trump, or like kind of the sort of opportunism and the kind of whiffling and just really kind of saying whatever will kind of get power. Like, I think that there's much more of a structured approach to Poilievre's policy. And, there has really been he's kind of towing this line in the Conservative Party in general between, say, more of the far right opinions of the People's Party of Canada, which is, a more obscure kind of right populist party who is, much more openly kind of xenophobic and broadly hateful, homophobic, etc., as opposed to the Conservatives, which, for example, are very in favor of immigration, now obviously kind of managed. And, they take a lot of shots at the Liberals for how immigration here has been managed. But, there's this notion of Canada as this land of opportunity, and it should be as such, and that's open. And it's not the same kind of drumming up of right-wing kind of almost alt-right kind of rhetoric that we see in the States. It's a lot more kind of managed, and Poilievre and the Conservatives in general, I think, are very nervous to kind of openly embrace that. And it's just a kind of, they sort of want that support, but they don't want to fully go there to kind of alienate their more moderate voters who could easily fall to the Liberals, kind of what Rose was describing there. So I see this largely as just a kind of inter-bourgeois conflict in a way, like you have these kind of slight cultural parties of kind of general middle class / ruling elite who are kind of bickering under the sort of larger contradictions of capital, which maybe we can talk about in the future. But I wouldn't say that it's enough to kind of have a substantial cultural shift, at least in my opinion.
Umer, you have anything to add? 'Cause if not, I can add.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, yeah, I don't think Canada's moving rightward particularly. I think like Pierre Poilievre is really, he's trying to capitalize on what's happening in the States. And so he puts on, populist sort of persona, but at the end of the day, he doesn't even really have any policies. If you try to look into it, like there's not much other than cutting the carbon tax, right?
No, guys, you have to drum up the fear that Pierre Poilievre
Fascism is happening.
that fascism is on the
Yeah.
rise.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it might be, but it's definitely not in Poilievre.
No.
And like, I think the liberals tried this tactic that the Democrats use with Trump, and it's just so not as believable because it's very clear to anyone who's, been around Canada for enough time to see like Poilievre is just a kind of Stephen Harper 2.0.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
there is a key difference though, which you guys all mentioned, which is that populist factor. Like, unlike the Republican Party, the Conservative Party has always been in Canada more measured, more elitist, even in the sense that they usually don't even want to try to pretend to care about working class issues.
Yeah.
They usually don't. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I think even Stephen Harper, right, in the last election against Justin Trudeau, he did the whole like Muslim scare, right? He was capitalizing on the Syrian refugee panic by saying, oh, instead of going, well, he didn't go full xenophobia, but he did it like this kind of subtle xenophobia where it was like, the niqab is such a big issue. We need to ban the niqab. And like, I'm pretty sure a lot of people are, critical of that, but it's like, it was such a clear culture war distraction issue. And I think that's part of why he lost because, as you mentioned, Rose, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, they have this excellent formula of kind of being like a simulacrum of progressivism in which they adopt whatever is getting popular or at least pay lip service to it. So there's one of those big things is electoral reform. I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of crazy that just looking back, Justin Trudeau promised to have a mixed member proportional system or a ranked choice voting. Either way, he said that he would basically change the first past the post system.
Yeah.
Well,
There's actually a really interesting interview that Justin Trudeau recently
Yeah.
did as Justin Trudeau starts getting back on to the press tour that he's clearly doing right now as we start to get into elections. So you can see he's starting to be out in public more again. But he recently did this, interview, and the interviewer asked him what was one of his biggest regrets since he's been in office. And he said one of his biggest regrets was not doing election reform. I highly encourage people to go and search it out. It's a really, really interesting response that he gives. And it sounds like it was one of those things where I just didn't get prioritized. Anyone who knows politics really well, especially Canadian politics, knows that it's very much a slow moving process. And it sounds like that was more of a case of that versus,
Right.
it just wasn't high enough priority is what it sounds like, which
Well, I
right.
don't know.
Well, I mean, also there's the fact that Justin Trudeau, if he implemented electoral reform that would allow for more third-party competition, that it
That's what
wouldn't
I was
benefit
gonna
his
say.
party.
Yeah.
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 And that's probably
Yeah.
why it wasn't enough
Mm.
put up on that because a lot of his party members, a lot of the MPs probably were not super keen to adapt a new policy on electoral reform. So for those reasons.
hmm Yeah, it's a difficult situation because, I mean, also like let's remember too, Justin Trudeau was kind of even to the left of the NDP leader in some issues, like Tom Mulcair at the time, who
Mhm.
was compared to the current NDP leader, which I'm sure we'll get to criticisms of later of the NDP, but Tom Mulcair was definitely to the right of the current NDP leader. I mean, he was, I would say, a neoliberal, like to
Yeah.
just on so many issues, like on merely, he bought into the deficit hawk rhetoric. He was criticizing Justin Trudeau for deficit spending, like he was saying Justin Trudeau wants to spend too much money and that you need to balance the budget.
The budget
was,
will balance itself. That line is drilled into my head from the various attack ads and whatnot.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's another thing I hate about Canada is like the deficit stuff here really does stick more than it does in a lot of places. Like in America at this point, like no one cares. I mean,
Yeah.
Elon Musk recently came along and said, "Oh, we're going to go bankrupt somehow on our own currency." But like Republicans and Democrats never gave a shit about the deficit since Clinton, at least. Like Donald Trump didn't care at all about the deficit. I mean, it doesn't matter. Like the deficit itself is not what matters. In Canada, we have
Until they started raising the debt ceiling in the last few years, then it became a big topic of conversation. But
which itself is a super stupid thing. Like just having a debt ceiling, it's a whole other story. I mean, people can watch my videos on the deficit myth if they're curious about that, if they haven't seen that one already. But yeah, I guess what is a risk that the Conservative Party is taking right now is that they're making the risk of actually pretending to care about working class issues, which is the whole populist rhetoric. And yeah, you mentioned that Poilievre, unlike Trump, doesn't really drum up this like disdain for immigrants. That's a big difference between him. He's really focusing on the working class issues, and that's why he's very popular in the polls. And as Umer said, does he have any solutions? I mean, the only thing he talks about is cutting a carbon tax and removing the red tape, which just
Yeah.
like regulations on building. It's like there's only so much that's going to do to really facilitate low-income housing. But the risk they're taking, right, is by actually pretending to care. You know, they're making a lot of promises and expectations. So I think in a certain way, Pierre Poilievre is like accelerating class consciousness
Yeah.
in a really odd way
He's
because
doing our
he's
work
like
for us.
well,
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. Like the debate in Canada has been mostly economic. I mean, there is a lot of culture war stuff here, but it's not as insane as America.
Mm.
America, it's like they're debating trans people in sports, whereas like in Canada, the hot issue is the housing crisis. So like, I kind of think Pierre Poilievre winning, which I think, I don't know, what do you guys predict? But I predict he's for sure going to win. It's just a question of whether it's a majority or minority government.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I kind of hope it, to be honest, in a weird way, because it's like I don't think there's much that's going to come out of the Poilievre government. And at this point, he's made all these promises that where people are going to go after he screws up. You know, like a part of me, kind of the accelerationist in me, wants to see it, even though he is gonna, he's gonna add more austerity, is gonna probably cause higher unemployment. It's not gonna be good. It's not gonna be good on the environment.
No.
But like, I mean, there's also not, I don't know. I don't think like you're gonna have a rise of Proud Boys in the same way. Maybe maybe we're later.
The Convoy was probably the closest for getting to that, and also the Convoy people are actually still very alive and well in Canada, even though they've fallen out of the news. They're still pretty alive and well. We could definitely jump into that a little bit too,
Sure.
if we want to talk about, are we moving to the right? Get out of
Yeah.
politics a little bit more and more about the actual attitudes and beliefs of Canadians themselves. I lived in Ottawa when the Freedom Convoy came to Ottawa. I was still in school at that time, and it was very surreal for me because I had gone to school and I was learning all these things about, I have a sociology degree. So I was like learning about like how people come together and how society works and all these things. And I also was a journalism student. So I was also actively reporting on the world. And then this came into town, and it was very strange because part of me wanted to go out and talk to these folks, and part of me did not. The part of me that did not was the fact that I kind of looked like a blue-haired lib, and I knew I was going to get my ass kicked if I got out there. I did have friends who did get attacked when they were out on the streets, which was really scary. But at the same time, I had my dad at home being like, Rose, you're one of them because you're a farm kid. Like, I grew up on a dairy farm in southwestern Ontario, and there was a lot of people from my community who had taken the trip to Ottawa for this. A lot of people I went to school with, a lot of people in my community, and people who grew up down the street from me. And it was such a strange thing to be talking about my experience to people who were there or who were following this and who were on one side or the other. And I think it definitely signaled a value shift in Canadian politics. There's a lot of people who came out of the convoy feeling more to the left, and there's a lot of people who came out of it feeling more to the right. My family went more to the left, right? Because they at first were like, these are just working class people who just want to be heard, who want to be able to do their jobs without having, and they want to be heard because they're a little hesitant about vaccines. They're a little hesitant about all this misinformation that's being put on social media. But once they started seeing all of the craziness that was coming out of it, they're like, oh my gosh, maybe we were looking at this a little wrong, right? But there's also people who have gone more to the right. But as the years have gone by and I've continued to do my journalism work, I have been in these right-wing spaces trying to report on them. And I'm seeing that they are, even though they are not as strong as it was when the Freedom Convoy happened, They are still bubbling, especially in the rural communities in Canada. There are still a lot of freedom groups, and they do like to go into rural communities, into drag story times, and they like to harass people there and protest there in those spaces. And there was a point in my life where I was following them around with a microphone and writing a podcast about it, but I had to step back for my own safety. But in finding that, it became really clear to me that a lot of those people that were partaking in that were people who were just really freaked out because their economic situation was not in a good place. And they were seeking out a safe space where they could feel like they were being heard and where they felt like they could find community. And those spaces ended up being a pipeline that took them towards more alt extreme right wing beliefs. And all of a sudden they found themselves fighting against trans drag story times. And it's really created a really interesting conversation in the rural communities, because now the rural communities are starting to realize that they need to do more work if they want to address this. But it's very clear from that, though, that it's very much a minority. A lot of the conversations happening in rural Canada are like fiscally conservative and socially liberal, as all Canadians famously like to be. But when it comes to social issues, by and large, most Canadians are still pretty somewhere in the center. If anything, a little to the left, just not understanding some of the more new, nuanced language and whatnot that's happening, especially around LGBTQ rights and Black Lives Matter and all these things, and Indigenous rights. They're still not sure about the language, and they don't know, and no one's talking to them and giving them education or talking to them nicely or talking to them compassionately about these issues. And so they're a little hesitant, but definitely open-minded. I think that's where a lot of Canadians sit still, somewhere in the center, but open-minded to the left. The trick is making sure that that open-mindedness doesn't allow them to go down the right pipeline, as some people are falling down.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the trucker convoy.
Yeah. Sorry for the long rant, but I feel like this has been a huge part of my life for a long time. I've been looking at this for years.
Well, it's
honestly,
interesting.
And I just had like an offload.
So that's interesting. You said your family had a farm, right?
Yes. I grew up near Stratford, Ontario, about a half hour outside of Stratford, Ontario, on a dairy farm in Perth County. And we neighbor right beside Oxford County, which is known as one of the most right-wing areas in all of Canada. So that's been a really interesting experience as I've grown up. But I also see a lot of things that would go against stereotypes that you would see for rural farming communities. So, yeah.
Well, I think you have a very nuanced perspective on the trucker convoy, because I was very disappointed by much of the left's response to the trucker convoy. Like, it was completely unilaterally very dismissive, even among not just liberals, but Marxists too were very dismissive. Marxists were even like, well, it's petite bourgeoisie. I'm thinking like, okay. It's like, do you not look at the patterns of socialist movements when they come to power? They usually have an alliance with one of the classes that's not all at once. Like, you can't, it's really weird. It's like, unless my guy, this very narrow idea of what the working class is, which is also changed in itself, is doing it must be bad. Like, I get some of it is a different class position to some extent, like, but it's still, people who have been hurt by COVID, it's been a lot of people, and a lot of people have been like people who, might be categorized as quote unquote petite bourgeoisie, right? And yeah, I mean, that's with proletarianization to a certain extent. Like, COVID shut down a ton of small businesses. It also just made it very difficult in general, because when the economy did open up, there was much less competition, and there was also all these holdups in international trade. So you had all these companies now like price gouging. So like the cost of living has been significantly worse for just about everybody, except, the people who are jacking up the prices, really. But it's been pretty terrible. I mean, like, inflation is pretty bad. I mean, it's gone down gradually, but the only way inflation's gone down recently has been by the government taking the classic neoliberal approach, which is let's make inflation go down by making people poorer, which is by cutting interest rates. That's what that is, by raising interest rates rather, which amounts to basically just making the economy worse, making people poorer so that they're too poor to afford shit. So they have to lower prices. That's what it is, folks. Like, if you don't see what raising interest rates is, that's what it boils down to. But what you mentioned about the trucker convoy, I think a lot of the reason people were so against it was because of the media coverage that looked a lot on the particular people leading the movement, like Tamara Lynch and Pat King.
I was so
not
disappointed in the journalism coverage of it. So disappointed.
yeah.
It's awful.
I think as well.
They looked at like it was a small minority of crazy far right clowns who were kind of representing that movement, and there were like one or two Nazi flags there or something like that, and they used that to kind of depict the whole thing. Whereas I knew on just from like looking at my mom's Facebook, I could tell like that wasn't true, because there's all kind of people who are supporting it from all sort of angles. I mean, a big shift I noticed is a lot of people who are in the sort of green hippie side of things, like even Green Party voters, or Russell Brand type of people. A lot of them who are like a little critical of vaccines, definitely didn't like the lockdowns, which that's totally understandable. But a lot of them like were very in support of the convoy. Then a lot of people didn't see themselves as right or left who were supporting it. It wasn't this simple picture people were portraying it as. And I think as you said, that a lot of people might have shifted further right after the convoy because maybe of a lack of left populist movement to sort of capitalize on that discontent. And also, I think a lot of people just didn't shift necessarily anywhere. They just kind of are still in this sort of limbo position, politically homeless, perhaps. But yeah, Matthias, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, just kind of to the disappointment of like the left's response too. I know that there was like a kind of celebration about like how that whole thing was dealt with as well, that it was somehow it was justified to use the non-withstanding clause, right? That was the term?
Emergency Act.
Yeah, from the Emergency Act. That's correct. Yeah, sorry. So I was thinking of the Ford thing. Sorry, my bad. But yeah, the Emergency Act to kind of break that up. And I think, and then as well, like the targeting of the organizers, like bank accounts and whatnot, and people involved in that. And, there was no jurisprudence or kind of like just process to that, right? That was just, okay, yeah, you're blocking the streets. We're going to kind of attack you on that sort of level. And I think,
froze their bank accounts. Let's just emphasize that for a moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's a crazy legal precedent.
And
that,
like,
like you think that's not going to happen to radical left-wing activists at some point?
Exactly. Like as
crazy people were supporting that,
Yeah, and a lot of people would think that socialists like ourselves would be like super like, yay, we went against this right wing, we shut down this right wing group. But like, there's a lot of personal freedoms and that have been infringed upon in that handling of it, right? That don't align with what we do and where we stand on things, right?
Yeah, and just in practical terms, I mean, as a group and as individuals, who want to stand up to capital and when required, in terms of strike actions, in terms of just general protests and whatnot, like in that sort of movement, yeah, one should be very, very concerned about what that means. And, it's a raising of the stakes for sure. And I think it sets a very, very dangerous precedent, and one that organizers of the left generally need to kind of contend with now, knowing that if you kind of reach that height, this is what the state can do. And that's now something that we need to tarry with that we perhaps didn't in the past. For sure.
Keep some cash on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that Pierre Poilievre's popularity is also partially due to the fact that he was one of the few Conservative Party leaders, even few leaders in Canada in general, to actually support the convoy, very opportunistically, of course, because if he was in power, he probably would have shut it down, just like how the Ontario premiers, who were, many of which were from Conservative parties like Doug Ford in Ontario, imposed lockdowns, right? Many of these, it really shows like whatever party seems to be in power of the status quo parties in Canada, they tend to be pretty bad with handling protests. I mean, the NDP government in British Columbia literally had the Wet'suwet'en protests shut down. I mean, you could say it's at the pressure of the federal government, but still, I mean, he sent in the police there first, and then he allowed the RCMP to be sent in against Indigenous activists. So it's like, there's a kind of talking point I noticed from the populist right, which is the left is authoritarian and it wants to, send cops at you. And it's like, really, I mean, like all three parties at this point are using authoritarian strategies to kind of shut down protests that disrupt capital in some way. And I mean, like the Wet'suwet'en protest was, at the end of the day, a response to oil pipelines being built on land where Indigenous people were living without their consent. And in the case of the convoy, this is something that's worth really emphasizing. I mean, one can have a gripes with the political inconsistency and sort of confusion that all of that represented, but the tactics they used to kind of get their demands, which really were, having the lockdown stopping and the vaccine mandates to get rid of the vaccine mandate, they basically used the kind of tactics that labor organizers used to use back in the day, or I mean, still use to lesser extent. But they basically kind of paralyzed trade between Canada and the US by sort of having a blockade right on the border. And that, I mean, is a direct threat to capital. In the case of the establishment news networks, they were literally saying that, that this is a threat to the economy, right? To the economy. It's like the same kind of thing you would have heard about the Canada Post strikes, right? It's like, oh, how dare they strike? How dare they disrupt? And it was really disappointing to see like liberals, and to be fair, not a lot of leftists, but I did see a lot of leftists not necessarily dismissing the feat of it all, but they were kind of dismissing the protest itself merely because of the class composition. I feel that is very foolish, because it's like, okay, they're petty bourgeoisie, so you're not going to try to talk to them. So you realize how fascism happened, right?
Well, and then it's like,
fascism was all the petty bourgeoisie people joining the National Socialist Party.
Well, but, it's also like what's your definition of petit bourgeois? Like, because like there's a there's a proportion of kind of like okay, these people have a house, okay, and it's and I think that inability to kind of struggle with the nuance or understand that, I think, has been a failing of the left here, right? That sure, there's you're gonna have a subset of workers that are homeowners, right? And that number's dwindling, of course, but like that's still a sizable portion, and that's still a dream for a lot of workers. And I think that's legit. But yeah, a lot of workers who are still own homes, like they're living pretty hand to mouth existences right now, right? Under pretty significant mortgage conditions and increasing interest rates, right? And it's largely just showing the conflict at the heart, downstream of the gears of capital, where you have housing, which is a human right and necessity, but then it's also treated as like a speculative asset, right? A lot of people are banking on this to retire off of and whatnot, and that is being threatened. That there's a lot of people now where it's like, even if they own a home, and they're working, they're kind of facing retirement. It's not the same sort of cash out that it used to be, unless they want to go move
their
like
house
several hours north. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's still an open question for organizers like ourselves, and just generally our fellow members of the left need to deal with, because I personally like to define class based on relations actually to like the means of production. Saying that someone's evil just because they own a home, I think, is very short-sighted and doesn't win you a lot of friends.
To be fair, to use to not strawman their argument, what they usually say is, the thing about the truckers is that a lot of them own their own trucks, so they're like,
okay, yeah, if you want to use that, sure.
And the real truckers, who are mostly migrant workers, who often don't own that means of production, they're the people, like, you know what I mean? Like, they're kind of trying to It's almost like weirdly pitting working people against each other in a certain sense,
Yeah.
but like it's very arbitrary and very silly, and I think it's a coping mechanism. Like to say like why are people who are, I think are part of the dominated classes. I tend to not look at the terms proletariat and bourgeoisie. I don't tend to use those terms anymore. I prefer dominant and dominated classes because within that means of production, right? There's a power relation. It's not just like the ownership, but the power relation. Like, do you have like, how much relative power do you have in the circuit of capital? And when it comes to, when there's a capitalist crisis, are you one of the first to lose or one of the first or one of the last to lose something, and or even one of the people to benefit from it? Because some people benefit during crises. And generally, like, yeah, of course, the workers get fired first and wages cut, but also, the small business owners or self-employed people get hurt as well, usually. So I think if you look at it in that sense, a dominated classes, I mean, I think it's more apt to today's situation because, if you have this very arbitrary thing, which is like someone must own nothing to be proletarian, it's like, okay,
No.
that leaves you only really with gig workers and, service workers at this point because, I mean, there's not a lot of industrial work like there
Yeah.
used to be in this country. It's a very
Well,
deindustrialized country.
and it's just not effective in terms of moving forward in progress to just measure, to be putting lines between the haves and the haves nots. Like, it's not effective by any means when the majority of us have a lot of in common, right? And a lot of us are striving towards the same thing, right? It makes no use to villainize people who own homes or even all landlords, right? Because there are mom and pop landlords out there. My parents are one of them, right? Like I say this as someone who actually does a lot of work against landlords, right? But like also there are situations sometimes, and we are in an era in society where you can't just outright villainize everyone, right? There's so much more nuance into these quote unquote categorizations, right? And if we're all striving towards into a better financial situation, does that mean that once someone moves themselves into a better financial situation, does that mean they are now the enemy, right? When by and large, the folks who we really should be fighting against are the folks who have been in power for generations, who have this vast wealth that is generational wealth, and they own these giant companies that are taking advantage of us, right? Like at the end of the day, it's not the person down the street who has the nice house down the street and maybe even has a second vacation property, right? And they've just retired nicely and they're comfortable, right? It's at the end of the day, they also have had their struggles and are probably being exploited in some way or manner by the 1%, right? So it's really about figuring out what our priorities are. And just to bring it back to Pierre Poilievre, I think he's doing a really good job of making himself seem like he's not the 1%, which is why he's also so popular. Whereas Justin Trudeau he's a Nepo baby, right? Justin Trudeau is quite the Nepo baby and is very famously a Nepo baby, right? And I think as we're moving towards this economic divergence where it's the wealth gap is getting larger and larger, people are starting to decide who's in that category. And a lot of politicians will try and keep themselves out of that category. A lot of politicians will say, I'm just like you. And yeah, Justin Trudeau's never had a leg to stand on with that, which I think is part of the reason why he's also losing some of his popularity.
Mm-hmm.
Pierre Poilievre has about $10 million in assets roughly to stand on. So, he's also kind of up there in the lead. I mean, it seems like a lot of our government does. There's a website called the Maple, which I'm sure you guys know of, which tracks basically MPs who and what they own,
Yep.
And it's pretty startling. Like virtually just about every conservative and liberal party MP is essentially well invested into the housing market, not just in terms of owning a house. I mean, like what classifies you is essentially an investor. Like you also own a property that, you don't live in, like you're kind of speculating in. And many of these people own multiple properties, collect rents from them. So it's like, there's a kind of conflict of interest there that should be pretty obvious. Surprising amount in the NDP too. Not as many, but there's a certain amount there. Yeah,
most politicians are not working people. That's
No.
At the end of the day, we got to remember that most politicians are not working people. Most politicians have not gone through the trenches like a lot of us have. You do have a handful who really had like a grassroots movement and moved their way up to politics that way. But the majority of politicians are lifelong politicians that got in early, who had a lot of things handed to them, not handed to them, but they just got really lucky in the cards they were dealt, and it made them perfectly situated to become politicians in their life, right? Um, a lot of politicians, for example, don't take the bus. Like a lot of politicians have never taken the bus, and they have no idea what public transit looks like. And so, how are you supposed to make policy about public transit when you've never been on public transit?
I think the housing crisis is arguably probably the most acute contradiction in Canada. Like if there's as far as, class goes in the struggle, housing is definitely like the number one hot issue in Canada. And it's a big issue everywhere, but it's been a lot worse in Canada for various reasons. I think one of the reasons why that is because America just has simply way more living space. So, even though the housing crisis got worse in a lot of places, in Canada, there's less living space and less houses. Well, there is living space, but most of it is frozen.
Well, yeah, and we're all hanging out close to the American border along
Yeah.
that nice line,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that literally all in one line, which has
Yeah.
no high-speed rail built there for some reason.
No.
But yeah, like it's been worse for a lot of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons, which I mean just is a fact, is the fact that while very little housing was built during, the past few years, there was a ton of immigration, like a lot of immigration, to the point where even the Liberal Party kind of admitted that they didn't handle the situation well. Mostly into a very small amount of areas too, mostly in Toronto, in BC, Surrey, and Vancouver particularly, but also Calgary. Calgary's gone up massively in housing. Montreal has, but not as much. So it's funny when Montrealers complain so much. I'm like, you pay under 1,000 Canadian. It's like, calm down. People would die for that here. Like, but yeah, it is like a difficult issue. So that has kind of, I think, led to a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, right? Because if you let in a ton of immigrants without building new homes, I mean, it's a formula for the supply and demand, right? It's just going to be more expensive, and you're going to have more people competing for very terrible prices, frankly. So that is the acute contradiction, it seems like, more than anything, more than even like proletarian versus bourgeoisie, even though that is always a kind of contradiction. It's always there, it's always alive. It's tenant and owners and tenants, I think, like more than anything. Although I did not to say to pit like everyone against, as you were saying, Rose, but like, I mean, that is like, I think, the conflict. And that's obviously something you guys do in your organizing, is tenant organizing, which, if you guys want to elaborate on that and why that's very important at this point.
Yeah. Umer, do you want to take this one?
You start, man.
Okay. Yeah, so we can get into the history of the DSC a little bit later, but essentially, we wanted to be a really like praxis-focused organization, right? So combining socialist theory with, on the ground, grassroots organizing. And we kind of did like an internal survey, when we were committed to that. At the time, we didn't really have a ton of members with like labor organizing experience. And, there's a lot of nuances and intricacies associated with that because it is a legislated space. And so, we kind of, at the time, just, like, let's let groups already kind of engaged in that work continue with that. And when the DSC formed as well, it was during COVID, and that's what I think really sharpened that contradiction that you were talking about there, Tony, right? Where we were seeing a lot of evictions and a lot of capitalizing on the precarity of working people. And so, yeah, we felt that the space was ripe for us to organize in. So we developed a tenant organizing program, kind of largely influenced from our research of labor, and then kind of applying it to the specific, renting context in Canada. And, typically that's provincially legislated as well. So it's kind of slightly different depending on which province you're talking about. But yeah, we felt it was a really effective way to politicize people, quite frankly, right? I think largely as the DSC, our opinion is that we can't really, or we haven't inherited that culture of mass struggle, quite frankly, right? Like, if it did exist, that's kind of gone by the wayside under several decades of neoliberalism, right? And breaking of unions and kind of generally just more atomized existences. And so, that reflex of facing, an issue with a landlord or an issue with a boss or whatever, that reflex to turn it into a collective struggle, I think needs to be built back up. And we felt that tenant organizing was just a really clear example of that, right? Because the way that tenant law is set up is it's, nominally, landlords will complain, oh, it's, to the deference of tenants a lot of the time, but we ignore that they have a lot more capital than those tenants, right? So they can just kind of drown people typically at the landlord tenant board. And so there's a great sense of futility of fighting these battles, as a single renter. And so that was an easy vector for us to teach organizing tactics to people and to bring about a critique of capitalism and bring about sort of a hope of a socialism to sort of emerge here. Yeah, so we've been engaged in that in the last couple of years. We've formed, several, if not into like the tens of tenants unions across the country, kind of with our different chapters. I can kind of speak best to Toronto here. And I think it's really exciting just seeing a lot of sort of organic growth on that front, certainly at the Toronto level, as sort of these tenant unions have formed. They're kind of talking to organizers like ourselves and other organizations that kind of do similar work, as well as amongst each other. And we're kind of unifying things a little bit to kind of win larger structural changes, or at least build towards that. So yeah, that's just kind of tenant organizing. We hope to, or we're working on getting into labor right now as well. But that was kind of our introduction to just learning as an organization how to do organizing work.
Yeah, you said talk about the DSA later, but I mean we can just get straight into that, the DSC, because people might ask, are you just a branch of DSA in Canada? So maybe give us a little history of what the DSC is, because frankly, I didn't even know it existed till probably a year ago. I don't think I even, I only got in contact with you recently. You actually were listening to One Dime Radio.
That's right. Yeah.
That's right. And
we got brought up on a podcast or an episode and just wrote you an email. And so now we're here.
Yeah. Because I was with Donald. I was talking to Donald Parkinson, who's a DSA organizer in his chapter in Florida. And he's also, head of Cosmonaut. He's a pretty known guy in like that kind of sphere. And he was asking what the scene is like here. And I'm like, yeah, I believe there's a Democratic Socialists of Canada, but I don't really know what it's up to. Come to think about it, like, because it's, in Canada, we don't really don't have that much of a organized left. I think we have left-wing people.
Yeah.
If you look at polls, actually, Canadians are remarkably more left-wing than Americans, at least as far as socialism goes. If you poll people on socialism in Canada, like, I don't know offhand exactly, but I remember seeing a few that had like, over 60% of people viewing the word socialism positively, but when you poll people on communism, it goes down. Super low. But I mean, that in itself is like decent. I mean, in America, it's a little bit more tough. I mean, until really the rise of Bernie Sanders, there was a kind of word no one even wanted to use, right? Like even people who were sympathetic to it. So yeah, it's been good to see, but there's in Canada, I mean, what is there? Like people know, I think people might have heard of a certain Trotskyist group called of the name of Fight Back. And yeah, like, let's just say that it has not the greatest reputation for a bit of a reason. And there's all the kind of little fringe communist parties. There is also the Communist Party of Canada, I want to say, like shout out, I forgot her name, even though she's been in power for like 80 years. She's been the same leader what's with these leaders of the communist parties? They're always, it's the same leader forever, which this is the problem with that kind of party structure. You can't change anything. But I look, I'll just say my take, and I'll let you guys unravel the history of the DSC and what it is and what makes it different from the American counterpart. But my instinct is that when there's not yet an organized movement to build a political movement on, it's kind of premature to go jump straight first into like a radical revolutionary party when there isn't
Precisely,
a
yeah.
movement. Like,
Yep.
so, para parties like the DSA in America that can at least be a base in which people can organize and kind of build a presence among people and communities and areas in which, that can get a positive association with socialists. Like socialists aren't just some, crazy people want to steal your toothbrush and make you share the same toilet or something, like, you know. So, okay, with DSC, yeah, just maybe give us a little history of that and the difference between DSA, just so you're, to be clear.
I guess, well, the DSC started in 2020, so like during COVID, contradiction or sharpening, I guess. And it was started by, maybe not the best person to start a socialist organization. He since was kicked out of the organization. He's a Zionist. And basically there was a Marxist caucus within the DSC that wanted to actually start doing more work, more organizing work, build, actually start building a movement in Canada, a working class movement. And that was in probably 2020, I'd say. And since then, we've mostly focused on like Matthias said, tenant organizing, and now we're getting into more planning around labor organizing. And maybe sometime in the future, we do have rural organizing, whatever that might entail, in our horizons. I think the biggest distinction between us and the DSA would probably be that as of yet, we haven't really focused on like municipal politics much at all, or beyond that. I think our position right now, and this might change in the future, is that like it consumes more energy than it's worth at the moment. So we've been focusing on just organizing in structures, like a building or a neighborhood or a workplace.
Yeah, I think at least from my perspective, I'm still pretty new at the DSC myself, but for the big thing I've noticed is that the DSC is very action focused right now, whereas the DSA has been around for a very long time, which means they are kind of past their grassroots movement stage and are very well organized, which means they have started to move more towards policy change, advocacy work, and trying to have more influence on the political conversation. Whereas I think the DSC right now, just because we are so much in our infancy stage, like 5 years is not that long in terms of an organizing group. Like our focus is really like, what can we do now to help people in a socialist way? And the biggest thing for us is we see that the big things people are struggling with are housing and work, right? Regardless of whether they're on the left or the right. Those are the two things that everyone I think can agree is they're struggling on. So we really focused on, okay, what can we do immediately right now to help them, right? And that's where we've landed, is with the tenant and the labor organizing. And those are our main two tenets of our work right now. And we'll probably grow and evolve as our membership grows and we have more capacity, more hands to do the work. But that is kind of the nature of grassroots movements and organizing. You kind of got to just do the thing, right? And eventually you'll have more people kind of join in and get excited and do the thing too, because they believe in the work you're doing, right? So I think the big thing we're doing right now, especially, is building our community, our network. There are, even though we don't have a lot of socialist or left-leaning organizations, they do exist, right? They are there, and we've also done a lot of work with forming coalitions with them and doing work with them as well, in case there is someday where we are all called to do a action for a bigger movement that requires a lot of hands or requires a lot of mobilization, right? And I think that's just a signal that people are struggling more and more, that those groups are gaining more and more popularity. I know we've seen an increase in membership consistently throughout the years, and I think that's because people are feeling a little bit more concerned about where we're heading. whether that's because they think we're going more right, whether that's because Pierre Poilievre, whether that's because Donald Trump,
Yeah, we got a
whatever it is.
pretty good bump after
Yeah,
the
we
American
did.
election as far as membership. So yeah, I think yeah, people are scared. People are feeling the precarity and are
People are worried
looking.
about their
Yeah,
jobs and they're worried about their house, right? People need like those at the end of the day, even if people don't see themselves as socialists, those are the two things they're most concerned about. Uh, and we just want to help people, right? We just want to help them make sure that they feel secure in their jobs, feel like feel secure in their homes, and like they can look towards the future positively. And so we're going to continue doing that work regardless
and I
for anybody. Doesn't matter their political affiliation. We're going to do that work for everyone, right?
And I think as well, to kind of add to Rose's point there, you know, I see this work right now and kind of just the union slash like organized space sort of structure is really vital because, you know, if socialism is to be strove for and you know achieved one day, like that will require, you know, sort of more engagement from the public in these things. Like it requires people to be engaged in politics, right? And, you know, I think that there's just so much apathy and cynicism, pessimism that sort of exists nowadays because people have felt left behind by their representatives, right? On this sort of altar of capital. And I see, yeah, not only are we trying to meet people's current needs, but it's also sort of training ourselves and them and yeah, and everyone sort of engaged in building this movement to, you know, become leaders themselves and be able to advocate for themselves and build that collective power. Because I think this sort of paternalistic relationship that a lot of people kind of have to power just through sort of, you know, the notion of, oh, I voted and that's all I can do, or all I can do is, you know, write a petition, you know, call my representative. That's all the power I have as an individual. You know, I think that it's not good enough, and it can't really face really the mounting pressures that everyday people are feeling. And so we need to present another option that people can actually believe in, who yeah, that they feel is powerful and meaningful work. Yeah, just to
And that they feel
run.
like they have a place where they belong and they're being heard and they have
Mhm.
community, right? Like a lot of the work we're doing right now is like getting tenants to just get to know their neighbors, right? Like, because they all have the same landlord and like, you can't organize without having your neighbors by your side. All of a sudden, you're meeting people you've never talked to who literally live a door down the hallway. And you have that conversation, you realize that they are also struggling and also going through the same thing you're going through. And there's solidarity in that, right? There is strength in learning that there are other people with you who are experiencing that same thing. And just in having that, you feel more empowered to be able to come together and do work, right? And one of the really interesting things that we as the DSC have been doing is just facilitating those conversations, right? We by and large are not leading a lot of these tenant movements, right? Like a lot of these tenant organizing, we're not leading it. We're allowing the tenants to lead it. And we're just there to help educate them on the laws and what they can do and how to best approach it. And we just are there to provide guidance essentially, right? And to help get the wheels turning. And I think that also is a strength of the DSC, right? Is that we allow people to do what's best for them instead of trying to impose our own opinions and thoughts about how things should be done when we don't have all of when it's not our experience. So I think that's really empowering for a lot of people as well.
Mm-hmm. Or the answers. It's another thing too. We get into later on when we talk about the back room about like the articulation of democratic socialism. Because
Yeah,
look, I prefer people who are honest about the generality of their vision and the aspects that need to be still worked through, as opposed to people who are overly confident in a very
yeah,
concrete set of doctrines, which, you know, you come to people with a very specific idea. This is the you know, the vanguardists program. It's going to be exactly like this. This is how it's going to happen, or this is, you have these set of ideas. I mean, people can see through that. People can see through also a sort of like they have their right to be skeptical, if they,
Yep.
And
yeah,
also, it's insanely hypocritical. Like, end of the day, socialism is the means of owning the production. And in a organizing sense, it would not make sense for us to be like, we're coming in and telling you what to do and how you should do things in order to be social. Like, socialism is allowing you to make the decisions of your own life and to have a say in how you do things. It would be incredibly hypocritical for us to come in and tell people how they need to do things. So I think that's also part of the reason why we've adopted the practices we have, and that openness to help groups do their own thing.
yeah, very good, simple advice that goes a long way. Talk to your neighbors, love thy neighbor.
Yep.
Which is like, like actually just go socialize with people. People debating labor theory of value and Trotsky and Stalin. It's like, just go outside,
Talk to your
Yeah.
coworkers.
talk to
Talk to your
somebody.
neighbors.
For real.
And
Make friends.
yeah.
Yeah, but to go back to DSC, that's a big difference there, right? Like DSA has been around since I believe 1982, started by Michael Harrington. It's had a lot of time, and it took a while for it to go anywhere. Like it built a base, but it was really like Bernie Sanders' first election and losing to Clinton, and then after again in 2020, where DSA saw a huge bump in membership. And I think it's seeing another big bump now that Trump's elected and the Democrats fumbled the ball again, as you should expect, because that's their job. It's not an accident. But yeah, you guys, from what I gathered, like pretty much, being a new organization, relatively, like just simply need more members, and that's the case with any new organization. So I'd encourage people, if they're looking to join one, to at least check out your local chapter if you're a Canadian, and if there's a local chapter in your area. What I will also add, like a kind of strength of big tent, quote unquote, organizations, which this sort of classifies as one, in the sense that it's, more democratic, more a little decentralized. There's not like a strict like leadership hierarchy in the way that like most political parties would have, because it's not like a political party in a electoral sense. It's a kind of para party, big tent organization, right? The strength of those in like in a stage where there is no like radical movement on the horizon is that, one, you can kind of like build a base before spending all those resources and time, which is in elections, which elections are super difficult. Like the People's Party had so much behind them, right? The People's Party is the kind of, I would say, far right party. I would say, in some ways, kind of just white nationalist. Like you could call all a white nationalist light party, if we're going to be charitable. But like they had everything in their favor. Like they're not threatening to the ruling class, so they might have had some financial support. They had, the leader was a former Conservative Party guy, Maxime Bernier, who was well known to the public, relatively speaking. And they had the whole vaccine issue to capitalize on. And even then, they I think lost a seat in the last election. They did not really do very well, even though they did have a rise in popularity, because like our electoral system, one, makes it very hard for parties to compete, and also to merely organize electorally, you have to just have so much resources. So for the gain in what you're putting in, it's not really worth the effort at that stage. But I also do think there is a place to play for a political party, but like at a non-revolutionary stage, right? Kind of actually just interacting with people. It really goes a long way. Like socialists having becoming likable and doing good work. But also in decentralized areas, I think that's another overlooked aspect of the strength of Big Tent organizations. In a country that's very geographically huge and decentralized, it does make more sense to have an approach where you have local chapters in different areas as opposed to a single party that kind of tries to have the same vision everywhere else. Because in a very decentralized area, people have different socioeconomic conditions a lot of the time,
Absolutely. Yep.
especially like culturally,
Hmm.
like Quebec, for example, is going to obviously be radically different than other provinces in Canada. And also in other provinces in Canada are going to have certain different issues, like rural issues are going to be different than the urban areas, right? So people are naturally going to understand their own communities more. Like Rose, you're going to understand, your
Oh
community
yeah.
more than someone who's just talking
Oh,
about.
I know this
Fine.
so well. Like very, very quickly. One of the things that's really interesting that has led me down the path that I have is the way rural communities organize and their strong sense of community, especially around farming and agriculture. By and large, rural communities are not far right. They are for farming, right? Like, and unfortunately, the Liberal Party has never been a has never been a great party that takes in the interests of the farming community. And for a very long time, that means that the farming community has not taken that in. And I will fully say, even though I consider myself left, there have been times where when I lived in my rural riding that I voted for the conservative MP or the conservative MPP in my riding because I believe in having politicians that represent the voices of the community that they are serving. And the MP Liberal Party has never put forth candidates that know the community and are willing to advocate for what the community advocates. Do I agree with the community wants all the time? No, I don't. But at the end of the day, we aren't just the Socialist Party, we are the Democratic Socialists of Canada, right? Which means democracy is a part of that too, which means even if it's not something I agree on, I still I at the end of the day will vote on someone who is for my community and who is speaking up for the people of my community and what they care about. And in that too, I think it's a really the other big part of that too is seeing that people who consider themselves conservative in political affiliation, their actions do not align with that, right? In my community, a huge thing that's been all over the news recently is the expropriation of farmland around the Waterloo region, around Kitchener-Waterloo area. And it's been really, really shady. There's been no really transparency about what's been happening in the area. And everyone in the community was like, this is some of the best farmland in Canada and in the world, and you're wanting to take that farmland from farmers for less than what it's worth, give them like a pretty penny for it for way less than what's worth, and not tell us what your plans are. And it kind of came out that Doug Ford was doing what Doug Ford loves to do and was making plans for his business buddies. And even then, there's still not a lot of transparency. There's a lot of finger pointing between different levels of government. But the community came together and decided to go and do a protest. And they drove all their tractors up to City Hall in Kitchener-Waterloo and made their voices heard. And their whole thing is like, at the end of the day, farming is about like, we want to own the means of production because they're farmers, right? They are creating a product, right? That's why quota exists. That's why all these different things exist. And in some ways, the farming community has been the most effective at helping advocate for policy that is socialist in nature. And it's quite interesting because you talk to all those people and you would think that they are very right leaning because of their social views, right? When it comes to other issues. But in terms of like the way they organize, it's very socialist in nature. And so I think it's really a great example of how we can't govern the way a group would organize, right? Like we can't, us in Toronto won't know how best to organize. Whereas the farmers in that area are like, yeah, we're going to drive our tractors down to the city hall and they're going to listen to us. And that was extremely effective, right? And so like to give them that freedom to do that kind of thing, I think is what it's all about.
That was really interesting. Like, I'm very excited to talk about that in the back room as well, because that I think pertains so much to an instinct I've had regarding strategy in Canada. Because there's a kind of, I think if there's a class contradiction that is neglected the most by the left, it's precisely that, the kind of rural struggles that are not very well understood. And anyone who knows about Canada's history, right, Canada's radical left history, the most successful socialist movement was, at least at the level of a party, was the CCF.
Yep.
And the CCF was, I mean, Tommy Douglas and J.S. Woodsworth did identify as Marxists, even if they were like kind of distanced themselves during the Cold War, and that they changed the name. And mind you, people are getting deported and put in labor camps for being communists. I mean, can you blame them? But they got pretty far in that strategy. Their strategy was a little unorthodox for a lot of socialist parties. It was a sort of farmer worker alliance, largely agrarian, right? Like largely based
Yep.
in the West, in the Saskatchewan and Alberta too, like the rural areas. So like the idea that rural people are always reactionary. I mean, it's not true, and it's also so self-defeating and
Mhm.
condescending. And you wonder why people they don't like people who are liberals or even on the left. And I think the left should stop siding with liberals in that sort of like condescending narrative that looks down on all rural people. I mean, and it's
Well,
like it
that
might
is starting to happen too, because there's also we haven't brought it up yet, but there's also the launch of that new party as well. The what's it called? The Canadian Future Party that was launched by Dominic Carty, and his whole thing is he's like fiscally conservative and socially liberal, right? But like it's very clear that he believes that we need to have an actual new left leaning party that is an alternate option to the Liberal Party, right? Because I think a lot of left people feel like they don't have a party that really identifies with them either, right? The way the Conservative Party does. So it'll be interesting to see how that also changes the election and the narrative and how the left vote as well.
Yeah, and it might seem mind-boggling that anyone in the rural areas would vote conservative, but the liberals and conservative parties are both the big business parties, and in some issues, like taxation, for example, like tax increases, which the liberals tend to impose on everybody except the uber wealthy.
Yep.
Like they love to impose tax increases, and they did impose actually a tax increase on small business, which I noticed that like talking to some friends' parents who were like in the construction business,
Mhm.
they would complain about that a lot. I mean, because that might not seem significant to a lot of people, but that can be very significant when you're like a small owner of a company, but like you're
And
in a,
Canada's driven by small to medium businesses
Yeah.
too. Like it's a huge portion of our economy, like
Well, yeah.
disproportionately compared to like the States.
And I think as well, to kind of tie this back to Poilievre, I think why he's, at least on matters of rhetoric, like so effective is because I think, to a lesser degree, but us sharing a border obviously with America, like we kind of still have that sort of like yeoman farmer kind of like dream about like this is what freedom looks like, right? Like you have your little plot of land, and you're like financially independent and the government kind of stays out of your business, right? Like that sort of Jeffersonian kind of model. And I think Polyev, yeah, I don't think in matters of his policy will actually bring that about. I think that time is come and gone. That's just the progress of history and the progress of capital, right? Like proletarianization, as you described, Tony. But he kind of appeals to that loss of that, right? Like he does say like, oh yeah, we want to start your business, we want to have you have a home. I don't think he's actually going to provide homes. It's just going to be houses built that are then going to be bought by private equity firms and landlords that already have property because they can just leverage that property to buy more. But yeah, I think just again in terms of rhetoric, he's kind of appealing to that, and I think the left needs to contend with that, and that's a very real concern, and perhaps part of that is sketching out a new definition for what freedom is, right? and moving away from that kind of Anglo kind of thinking, like your Locke's and your what's his name, the founding fathers, that kind of economic arrangement, and towards a different definition for the future, let's say.
Well, in many ways, that different definition, you could say, is closer to some of the ideals that they espouse
Well,
than
that too.
a lot of what exists today, which I mean, like, already there's thinkers in the Industrial Revolution who were saying, that's why Marx himself, right, when talks about capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, he says it's bourgeois society in crisis,
Hmm.
because like the ideals of the revolution are kind of put into crisis, like the economies of this, agrarian, Jeffersonian utopia you're describing. I mean, like with the Industrial Revolution, that totally goes into crisis
Yeah.
because that's not the ideal that most people experience. But like, that is something unique about Canada's culture. I mean, that it has in common with the US, and some will point out the very obvious fact is that, yeah, we're both settler colonial countries, right?
Mhm.
Like that's, we have land. So there is this kind of like idea of you can own. That's why a lot of people immigrate to both our Canada and the US, because it's like, you can have an opportunity here. You can kind of have a fresh start. Some people like will take that fact, like the settler colonial thing, and I think use it to a way to like dismiss the revolutionary potentials of people who live in these countries in general, which I
Yeah.
think is kind of self-defeating and very silly. But like, the thing there though is like, yes, every country has its sort of political culture, if you will, and the new movement has to kind of adapt to that. You have to meet people where they sort of are.
Mhm.
I think Canada is like the US in that sort of sense that it does have that culture a bit, but it is, I would say, even more socialistic, but also less revolutionary. It's less radical
Yeah.
in that like people are less likely to go on the streets, and people are certainly less likely to support people going on the streets. Because I saw with the trucker convoy, a lot of people were complaining, especially in Ottawa. They were a lot of them weren't even complaining on the grounds of ideology. They were just saying, "Is this too loud? Stop making so much noise." Like they really don't like they don't like violent agitation, or not even non-violent, just like loud agitation in the way that Americans are sort of used to. But we're more socialistic culturally in the sense that like Canada's been more collectivist. People tend to forget there was a point in time where even the Conservative Party paid lip service to socialist ideals. People might remember John Diefenbaker, the so-called Red Tory, the Red Toryism, which was called red for a reason. And, it wasn't just the flag. It was also because, I mean, they did do stuff to appeal to the growing socialist sentiments. Like, they created the CBC for one, but also like very much like created jobs for the poor. They would talk about how all the classes, need to be in harmony. The working class, the aristocrats, the bourgeoisie, they had their own kind of weird socialistic
yeah.
politics that in a non-Marxist sense. But like, imagine a climate like that where like even the right wingers are like more socialistic. I mean, we're so far from that at this point. Like,
Mm-hmm.
There's a better argument for why Pierre Poilievre is not Trump. It's that Canada is inherently in our culture is inherently not radical, right? Like we are a country that is very much about norms, about traditions, and staying inside of those norms. And that means that even when you have a right party in power, they're inevitably going to have to make sure they don't rock the boat too much, right? The thing with Donald Trump is the state of America and the culture of America allows for Donald Trump to rock the boat, and people will feed into that. They will embrace that because the US definitely feeds off of polarization and feeds off of this radicalism, both on the left and on the right. And it's part of the drama of it all of the US, right? The US politics loves the drama. But when you talk about Canadian politics historically, very boring, right? Like very like Canadian politics, Canadian elections are historically really boring, right? Like no one tunes into them. Nobody watches the debate because they're boring. And I will never forget this. I had a political science teacher tell me when I was in university that boring politics is the sign of good politics, right? Because That means that the focus is on policy rather than on the characters and the personality, right? But yeah, I'm seeing some head shakes. Might be a little controversial, but like Canada's really built around, especially just in the way we are set up as a government with the Senate and with the House of Commons and the division of powers between the provinces and the federal government. A lot of it's not written in our constitution, right? A lot of it is based on norms, based on tradition, and it's seen as very controversial when a politician steps outside of that, even if it's not completely written into our constitution, right? So I think Canada inherently, our politics likes to make sure the boat's not rocked too much, right? Like we want to stay in our comfort zone. And if we do change, it's usually very slow change, very intentional change. Policies take new policies, new bills take years, decades to get through. That's like, you can disagree with me and I would love to hear why, but like, by and large, like that is historically, at least, what Canada is known for.
I think your overall point is right, which is like in the sense that like there's not these like radical crazy ruptures, right?
No.
Like we're a more slow culture politically, but I think there has been major changes in this country, and I think they get overlooked because of
absolutely.
of how boring our politics is, right? And how like at the level of rhetoric, nobody is very extreme. But I do think Stephen Harper did essentially like a sort of stealth revolution, like
Yes.
of a neoliberal sort, right? Like
Yes.
I mean, he really did shift the country economically even more right wing, like significantly, like in even his own party, because people might not know that Stephen Harper basically changed what was previously the Progressive Conservative Party, which was still a kind of neoliberal party, but that and the Reform Party basically fused. And he's like a Milton Friedmanite. He's studied at the University of Calgary under a bunch of hardcore neoliberals who believed in things like even that schools should be privatized. I'm not kidding. Like that's an idea he believes in. And
Let's go.
like
Yeah.
Stephen Harper is very much accelerated a lot of the neoliberalization that was happening really since Mulroney and Chrétien. It's a two-party effort, but there is I do want to, before we go into the back room, address the People's Party, because I am afraid that someone might listen to this and agree with everything and be like, yeah, I guess I'll vote PPC because they're the lesser evil. And look, let's just address that for a moment, because the People's Party, led by Maxime Bernier, I mean, it's not you can't even grant them that, like, some parties are socially very right wing and economically left wing. They're not even like economically left wing. They're just right wing on everything. I mean, his idea, he believes in balancing the budget, and he wants to have a flat tax, which, okay, if you lower taxes maybe for the working class and small businesses, I'd be for that, right? I'm very for that, actually. But like, he just wants a flat tax, which benefits rich people more than anything. And it's also, he wants to balance the budget. So do the math.
Yeah.
He's going to cut like all the social programs for the poor. So it's like, it would be a fucking disaster. He's not even close to being a red Tory or anything. And also his solution to helping working people is literally just to kick all the immigrants out. And with him, that's not a total exaggeration, because it's like the Conservative Party, the mainstream, is not very extreme on immigration at all. They're not that different from the Liberal Party. But the People's Party, at least in terms of how they talk, it's not just like, for them, we have too much immigration. That's like one argument you could make, like in a small amount of time, sure. But they say, it's like about the Canadian values. Right now, I would be at the level of surface. It's like, sure, I agree with that. You should adapt to the society you're in. But what are you really talking about? Because he always says, if you look at like his Twitter page, Maxime Bernier only seems to complain about Indians and Muslims. Like, it's only those two groups he's always on about. And he talks about old stock Canadians, this idea of like the old original Canadians. But he also thinks the residential schools, what is said about them, is exaggerated, and actually they weren't that bad. So like, do the math, folks. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like I think it is a kind of like light white nationalism, and not even he's he's economically to the right of Hitler still. Like in the case of like he doesn't even want social programs. Like he's just bad on everything. So like anyone talking about the People's Party, and also they're just a bunch of morons. That's just my opinion too. Like they're not even competent racist people. Like like
They do like to talk in dog whistles though, which I think
yes.
I think also like we talked about earlier, there are still like far right groups that exist, and I think the PPC appeals to those far right groups, especially the groups that are really socially right. I think at the end of the day, that's what the PPC is just there for, is to provide a party for those folks who very much are concerned about DEI, who are very much concerned about LGBT, about the overtaking of trans rights and whatnot, right? And who are really like the PPC is playing into the fear mongering, right, of a lot of the socially progressive issues that most Canadians are taking a stance on, right? And so the PPC is just playing into those, right? And still at the end of the day doing it kind of covertly so that they hope they can at least not make it too obvious.
The sort of rightward reaction when it comes to the social issues, I do see though across the spectrum, in the sense that like I see just a lot of normies, quote unquote, also get very into those issues, but also it's across racial lines too. I do notice a lot of more socially conservative migrants also. So I will say on those issues, like it's more confusion than anything, I think, because it's more newer issues. The PPC though, where I think it makes them more like radical in a non-good sense, is the kind of hardcore anti-immigrant stance, because it's not just like, let's reduce it, let's have it more measured, let's restructure it to have it make more sense. It's like less brown people. I mean, that is like their kind of ideology. Maxime Bernier is a little bit more subtle with it, like in terms of dog whistling, but I mean, people in his party aren't. I mean, like people in his party are. That's what I meant by run by a bunch of morons. Is like they actually sometimes retweet neo-Nazi stuff. A lot of the time, they just straight up retweet neo-Nazi accounts, and like I guess they don't care if people will do any investigating whatsoever. But yeah, that's that. I just wanted to kind of address them, because like there's some people who are like socially a little conservative and maybe like workable on most things. I'll be willing to like work with those people and talk to those people, like if they're, as long as they're not gonna like hurt anybody, right? I don't see that with the PPC. Like I just don't really see them even like as a sort of, because in Europe you see all kind of parties emerging that do tail like right-wing sentiments to some extent. In Germany, there's, even in Mexico, the one that won kind of sometimes, at the level of rhetoric, appeals a little bit more conservative than it actually is, and governance is pretty progressive. PPC though, it's like I just see them as a kind of single issue party, and that is migration.
Well, and I think
migration got too insane since the 1950s, which tells you everything you need to know. So they think in like after Lester B. Pearson is when it all went to shit.
I think kind of just to that point, right? Like we're socialists at the end of the day. Like we still have our progressive cultural values that we're gonna stick to, right? It's the difference between sticking to them and still speaking to people versus like the very much like you either need to completely agree with me like right here and right now, otherwise like I can't be talking to you. No, like you can still hold your values and still like establish trust and discussions, with those, just with regular people, who might have the odd off color opinion or whatever you kind of like to describe it as. And I mean, I'm personally a Marxist, and like, it's the whole base superstructure kind of analogy, let's say, right? Like, if you can kind of get people together to kind of like fight for a common economic goal, then like I think a lot of the cultural sentiments will flow to a more progressive state kind of with that. Obviously we need to kind of throw in the direction every now and then, but like in the States, for example, like integrated unions, labor unions were incredibly important to the overall civil rights fight, right? Because a lot of those cultural issues kind of collapsed in the face of necessary solidarity. And I think if there's anything to kind of cut through the stagnation under the culture war, it's an embracing of like mass class politics. And, I think that that's really what we're committed here for, while still maintaining a welcoming and protective environment of marginalized communities, for sure.
Yeah,
Another
100%.
Now that I'm thinking about it, if Pierre Poilievre like wasn't trying to appeal to like populist rhetoric, the PPC might have, more sway. Like,
Yeah.
And actually, if Pierre does win, and he can't deliver on his promises, which he won't for sure, and like we don't have socialists in Canada don't have anything to offer to people, there is a chance to go even further right.
Socialism or barbarism, That's, it's true. Under the kind of mounting crises under capital. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is something I expected a little bit. Like, if I do hope that Maxime Bernier continues to be a leader, though, of the PPC, because he's such a moron. Like, literally, he's just such a good opposition. I mean, he's a French guy who talks about Canadian values. I mean, it's like he doesn't even like he thinks that like Quebecois Canadians and like white supremacist Canadians in the West and Ontario are going to somehow like all unite on the base. Like, it's like that didn't even work back when Canada was more racist, so it's like, how's that going to work now? I don't know. But like, yeah, he's just like, if someone who's a PPC voter and is like, wasn't listening to that part, was only listening to the kind of trucker convoy stuff, or was, the free speech stuff, it's like, okay, that I'm fine, fair enough. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't usually blame the mass, more so the person purveying on them. But yeah, I mean, I can get behind free speech, and I think, we all of us think what happened to the response to the convoy was insane and unjustified. But yeah, the PPC it can't even say it's socialism for the fools. It's like just like
it's like the common ruin for the fools. It's just like,
yeah.
It's just gonna be shitty for everybody.
It's like neoliberalism for the fools.
Yeah.
It's just like, I don't even. It's just not even, they're not even packaging it in something like good. It's just shit package and shit. But yeah, without further ado, yeah, I'd like to transition to the back room to talk about strategy for a little bit, because, we're talking about class politics and organizing. And I think I would really want to go back into that conversation. But you were talking about, Rose, about like the rural communities, because I have certain ideas around certain alliances and stuff. And I mean, it's not unique to me whatsoever, but I do think it's not discussed enough by people on the left. So yeah, we'll get straight into that. If you're not a member of the One Dime Backroom Patreon podcast already, if you are a regular listener to this show, it's less than literally latte, and so you can boycott Starbucks and stop spending so much money on goddamn lattes. And $5 for a whole month, you get access to the whole backlog, and you get 46 exclusive episodes at this point, and you get also the Discord. You can talk to a bunch of people who also listen to the show and watch the videos. So yeah, see you there.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.